Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Friday, June 13th, 2014. Friday the 13th for all you Trishka-decaphobics and Knights Templars out there. And we have got so much to talk about. It's just insane out there. It just feels like it's spinning completely out of control, which, if it's Friday the 13th, bad things are supposed to happen. Now, phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Craig is sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials and keeping us out of trouble. Dr. Gilbert Levin will be joining us in hour number 3. The Lady Claire is not going to be able to make it in for the show today because she's busy doing a bunch of other very important things here. But we're going to be talking with Dr. Levin about the latest developments in this whole issue about, life on Mars. And did we, in fact, find it all the way back in 1976? And NASA, for political, sociological reasons, just kind of, the people don't need to know about that. Sort of a replay of that whole Marco Polo business. Now, getting on to the stories today, there's a lot of stuff going on. You've probably already seen on the corporate media, Obama got out today and made a speech about how important it was to have the responsibility to protect what's going on in Iraq, and he's going to be basically authorizing drones, airstrikes. At this point, he's saying there will be no U.S. troops on the ground. And if you believe that one, I have some of Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons to sell you, because he could change his mind further on, and he could send in Americans as advisors and trainers. They're not troops, they're advisors, and just get around it that way. But he's still out there talking about, it's all Al-Qaeda, and it's the insurgents, the sectarians, and it's the Sunnis and the Shia. And the president's pants are on fire here, because calling the people of Iraq terrorists or Al-Qaeda or militants does not obfuscate the fact that the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 under the trumped-up pretext of Saddam's nuclear weapons and installed a puppet ruler to control Iraq's oil, and more importantly, make sure it was bought and paid for using U.S. dollars borrowed at interest from the Federal Reserve. The people of Iraq are now kicking out their U.S. puppet ruler, just like the people of Iran did back in 1979. The American empire is trying to find a way to put down the rebellious province, without the war-weary American people seeing it as another invasion and conquest so soon after the last one. And I'm not the only person who's catching this, because there's an article over at Activist Post saying exactly the same thing, America's covert re-invasion of Iraq. And that's exactly what it is. This model of conquer and everything will be fine has fallen apart. This model of covert overthrow and everything will be fine has fallen apart. In the age of instantaneous global communication, the people of the world understand exactly what's going on and what the United States has really been about for the last half century. And people are looking at this and saying, this is Obama's mishandling, this is Bush's mishandling, and the forces in Iraq, the people of Iraq, the insurgents, for lack of a better name, the freedom fighters. Let's call them what they are, freedom fighters. They're fighting for their freedom from American corporate governance. And they're making huge strides, and it's creating some interesting geopolitical consequences we'll be getting into in a little tiny bit. But do you remember all the way back in 2003 when we were being told about Saddam's illegal nuclear weapons? And we had George Bush and the neocons, and they came out with, they will shower us with flowers when we invade Iraq. The oil will flow freely, the war will pay for itself, and we know where those weapons of mass destruction are. All blatant lies and complete ineptitude. And today, the end results are in. We've absolutely destroyed that country. We've destroyed its cultural heritage. Remember when the army invaded Baghdad, they posted armed guards around the oil ministry and left the Baghdad Museum wide open to be looted? Remember when Biden once called Iraq one of Obama's great achievements? And that's coming back to haunt him? Maybe, because if you look at the quality of Obama's other achievements like Obamacare, using the IRS against his opponents, the NSA spy scandal, Benghazi, how they got bin Laden, and human-caused global warming, it might actually still be true that Iraq is one of Obama's great achievements. Just none of them were really all that great to begin with. We're going to grab some phone calls here. Steve in Massachusetts. Aloha, Steve. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Steve in Massachusetts, are you there?
Steve dropped.
Steve dropped. All right, Steve in California. Steve, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, how you doing, Michael? Hey, you also forgot left out all the archaeological finds in art that was stolen by our country also after the invasion of Iraq. So there's a lot of stuff they stole. There's a lot of transaction going on in the art world.
They absolutely destroyed a lot of it. I mean, the U.S. government built an air-based runway over the remains of the city of Ur. It's like they wanted to bury Iraq's antiquities, and of course this is going to make Israel very comfortable because Israel's got this, story about the greatness of Israel, but there's hardly any archaeological evidence to back it up. But if you go into any other country in the area, like Egypt especially, and Iran and Iraq, you can't take two steps without stumbling over the archaeological remains of their ancient history. And so Israel would very much love for all these other artifacts to go away because that would level the propaganda playing field.
Actually, that's not what I called about, but I just want to add that in there. No, I was doing some fact-checking this morning on all the different networks, the corporate media, and they're spinning this story of 74 school shootings since Sandy Hook.
Yes.
And where does that stem from? Where does that report come from? They trail it back to Michael Bloomberg, his report, and basically they categorize and they classify any school shooting, even as a school shooting, anything near a school counts. And they just add everything else in there also. But the actual number is, and it's not a good number. Any number more than one is too many. But there's actually 15 school shootings since Sandy Hook. But they're spinning the story of 74, and the White House, even Obama, has spun that lie of 74 school shootings since Sandy Hook.
Well, it's interesting. The Washington Post put out a map a couple of days ago showing all of these school shootings all across America, and it was a bad move for them to do because the first thing everybody noticed is all these shootings were taking place in states with really strict gun laws and gun-free zones, and it hammers home the point that when you have this ordinary citizenry allowed to keep and bear arms, crime and craziness goes down. You look at all these mass shootings and everything, they're always going into some place where it's a gun-free zone because that means, hey, nobody's shooting back.
Yeah, what Fox did point out in this analysis was that not school shootings, but shootings in general had increased in the cities of Chicago and New York City. And they gave an actual number to that date and on a weekly basis of how many shootings they have. And but they don't talk about that. The media really doesn't talk about that. I was really surprised that Fox brought that up.
Well, especially because in Chicago and New York, they have very, very strict gun laws. But as we reported yesterday, there are two reports out, one from the U.S. government itself and one from Pew Research that show gun violence overall across the nation is in a major, major decline as the American people arm themselves. But
I totally agree.
The gun grabbers are desperate. They're trying to figure out some way they can disarm the American people because, by golly, we see the lies, we see the real agenda for the war, we see the tyranny and dictatorship, and we are absolutely opposed to any more looting of the American people to prop up this failed Ponzi banking system.
You hit the nail right on the head.
Yeah, okay?
Yep.
All right, we got to let you go here. We're coming up on a commercial break. I know we've got another caller waiting on the line, and we're going to take your call just as soon as we come back. Concern being expressed over at Activist Post if the U.S. might try and use what's going on in Iraq to open a front for an outright invasion of Syria now that Assad has won re-election. We'll be back after these words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're getting word that the U.S. aircraft carrier, the George H.W. Bush, has just been deployed to Iraq, or however close to Iraq they need to get to launch airstrikes. Even as fast as that carrier is, the freedom fighters in Iraq are just mere miles from Baghdad. Last report I heard was they were somewhere between 70 miles away from Baghdad. A good hard push, and they could be there. And this thing will be over before the carriers can get into position. We're going to take a phone call here. Jerry in Chicago. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. Thank you very much for taking my call. Hey, I got two questions about Iraq. When we invaded over there, it was kind of important after they secured a couple of the things and blew up all their infrastructure to get into the Baghdad bank or the Iraqi bank. What do you know about that? Not the bank, I'm sorry, the museum.
Well, the museum was left completely unguarded, and it was pretty much looted. Now, some of the items have been returned. Apparently, some of the media people just thought they could help themselves, and they were caught coming back into the United States with these antiquities, and there are international laws that prohibit that sort of thing. But, yeah, it was one of the issues that made everybody understand that this war was all about the oil resources and controlling them and making sure they were sold only for the U.S. dollar, that they literally had armored troops around the oil ministry, so nobody could get in and mess with those files and maps, and the Baghdad Museum was just left wide open.
Well, the next question I have for you is, once we got Saddam Hussein, why didn't we pull our troops out of here? Why weren't we done?
Well, okay, I'm getting all kinds of intermittent sounds coming. I think it's a Skype issue where I'm getting soundtracks from something else here. But to answer your question, Saddam Hussein was merely held up as the villain we had to get. And the U.S. troops were kept in Iraq with the justification that they were still looking for the weapons of mass destruction, but what they were really doing was garrisoning Iraq. It's like the ancient Roman Empire. Okay.
Start help.
Craig, is that coming from you? I'm hearing bits and pieces of commercials come through.
Yeah, I heard it too. Just a second. Look.
All right. Well, while you're working on that, Craig, getting back to Jerry, this is like the ancient Roman Empire. They would conquer some other country, and they would have to station a Roman legion either in or very near to that province to make sure they didn't get ideas like breaking away and doing what they wanted to do ever again. And that's exactly what the U.S. has been doing all across the globe, to the tune of over 700 bases on foreign soil around the globe. Once it was generally understood there had never been weapons of mass destruction, if that had been the real reason, the U.S. troops would have come home. But the real reason was control of Iraq's oil so that it was sold on the world market only for the U.S. dollar. I mean, it was only in 2002 Saddam got permission from the UN to sell Iraq's oil for the euro. 1 year later, they invade, lynch the guy, and say, you got to pay for the oil with dollars and not euros. And that's really what the agenda of all these wars is about, is bringing all the world's resource-rich areas under U.S. control so that all the other nations of the world have to come to the United States and first get U.S. dollars before they can buy the raw materials they need. Okay?
Well, one more thing, if you don't mind. I've talked to two kids, maybe in 19 or 20 years old, and they don't see a very good future here as far as the economy goes and everything, and they're talking about joining the military. And the only thing I told them is, I says, take 58 minutes of your life and watch a YouTube video called Beyond Treason, written by two people that were in the military. And tell me if you still want to join, because I think that's very important. But thank you very much for taking my call, Michael. You have a great weekend.
All right. Well, thank you very much here. And absolutely, we know that one of the reasons for the government to crush down the regular economy for ordinary citizens, especially for young people, if you look at the sky-high jobless rates for young people, it is to leave them no choice but to join the military. And Claire and I had first-person experience with this. We went down to the bottom of the hill. There used to be a Zippy's there. They've now gone out of business. And we saw this whole line of kids in Air Force T-shirts waiting for the bus to go wherever new Air Force recruits were going to go. And they all said the same thing. They didn't want to be in the military, but there was absolutely no other choice. There were no other jobs. And it was stay at home with the family, which wasn't an option for all of them, join the military, or be homeless instantly at age 18 through 20. And it's a covert economic draft. The reason for a dictatorship to impoverish the general population is to remove options from them, to make them so dependent on doing as they are told merely to eat tomorrow's meal that there's no chance they'll stand up and say, look, we don't like the way this country's being run. But it is an economic form of draft, and I know a lot of young people are looking at that as their best option, but along with that video that Jerry was talking about, look at how the returning wounded veterans are being treated. and look at the veterans who are returning who have not been wounded but are now hopelessly hooked on prescription psychiatric medications and just seriously mentally messed up. Before you sign up with a military recruiter, you need to go spend some time with people who've been there and come back. And some survive the experience and they're doing really well. But a lot of them are not. And one more thing you need to remember before you go over to that recruiter and talk to them. The courts have repeatedly affirmed that promises made by military recruiters to get you to sign that paper are legally unenforceable. So when that recruiter is out there with that little enlistment form he wants your name on and says, look, if you sign this, I guarantee we're going to train you to be a pilot and fly transport planes and we'll open up a career as a commercial airline pilot after you get out. They don't have to keep that promise. And if you spend your entire career in the Air Force changing oil in helicopter transmissions, you can't sue them for a broken promise. They are allowed to say anything at all it takes to get you to sign that paper. So, anyway, Jerry, thanks an awful lot. We're going to let you go here. And I want to talk a little bit about the Constitution of the United States of America. Now, Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution gives the executive branch ultimate command of the nation's armed forces. But Article 1, Section 8 reserves to the legislative branch the power to decide when the United States goes to war. The Congress shall have power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. The President does not have the authority to just haul off on his own and say we're sending in the troops and drones and aircraft anywhere on the planet. Now, back in 2002, the United States Congress tried to shirk their duty of oversight of when we go to war by passing the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Iraq Resolution of 2002. On March 18, 2003, President Bush submitted a letter of transmittal to the U.S. Congress activating that congressional authorization for the use of force in Iraq. In that letter, Bush stated Iraq was in defiance of the United Nations ban on weapons of mass destruction and that the invasion of Iraq was needed to punish those responsible for 9/11. Both those statements were flat out lies. Bush himself later admitted, and we've got it on video linked to this article, that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11 and there were never any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. President Bush lied to the U.S. Congress when he claimed to have proof of both of these assertions. We had the forged Niger Yellowcake documents, the facts, the behavior of the White House to keep that forgery secret, the dodgy dossier, all proved the lies that started the Iraq War were intentional. That makes that first invasion of Iraq a war crime. It's illegal and unconstitutional, committed by the president, and the Congress was the accessory to the crime because they did not check the president's statements. They didn't carry out their oversight function, which is essential to the separation of powers doctrine. All right, we're going to take a break for some commercials, and when we come back, I'm going to take this revelation and carry it forward into the present context. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. So we're talking about how we got into Iraq in the first place. Back in 2002 and 2003, oh, Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. Saddam keeps his library books out too long. Saddam passes wind in elevators. He tears the tags off his seat cushions. He dances barefoot on shag carpeting and all this other stuff that we were being told about why we all had to go get Iraq. And it was really about the oil and, more importantly, what currency the oil would be sold for. So Congress sort of shirked their oversight responsibility as to when this country goes to war by passing the authorization for the use of force in Iraq in 2002. It was sort of a carte blanche. You know, we're going to leave it up to the president, and we will trust the president to decide when we have to go into Iraq, is basically what Congress said there. And on March 18, 2003, President Bush activated that authorization with a letter to Congress that made two claims, both of which were lies. Bush claimed to have evidence that Iraq was behind 9/11 and that Iraq was in possession of banned weapons of mass destruction, neither of which turned out to be true. In fact, we've got Bush on videotape saying, oh, no, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Now, the president is not allowed to lie to the people of the United States. It's nowhere in the Constitution. The president is certainly not allowed to lie to the Congress. And the Congress, having been lied to and knowing now irrefutably they were lied to, were duty-bound to initiate impeachment proceedings at that point against President Bush. Remember, when Bill Clinton was impeached, it wasn't for having the sex, it was for lying about it. Lying to Congress under any situation is a high crime or misdemeanor. Lying to start a war is the worst crime a leader can commit against their own people. It's the highest of all the high crimes and misdemeanors possible. So the war in Iraq was illegal and unconstitutional and constituted a war crime. It was illegal for the United States to invade Iraq in the first place and set off this entire mess. That brings us here to the present circumstance. We have the people of Iraq trying to take back their nation from the U.S. puppet regime, Maliki in this case, just like Iran did in 1979, kicking out the Shah. And Obama is already ordering the U.S. military forces to re-invade Iraq and teach those uppity Iraqi people that the United States, and primarily Wall Street, now owns their nation and its oil. And once again, the president is starting a war without a formal declaration from Congress. And worse, Congress is refusing to obey their duty to tell the president, tap him on the shoulder and say, look, you're not supposed to do this unless we say so. It was illegal for the United States to invade Iraq in the first place, and it is equally illegal for the United States to be sending in the airstrikes again today. Now then, a little bit of a side note I want you to think about. Anytime a politician gets caught using government property for their private use, they're forced to reimburse the Treasury. You'll see a congressman who takes a government flight to take his family on vacation, and there really wasn't a legitimate government purpose for the flight, and they'll say, you got to pay back the Treasury for the use of the plane and the fuel and the staff. And that should also hold true for presidents when they use public property, in this case the United States military, for private little unauthorized illegal wars of their own. Why should we, the people, pay for the costs of the war in Iraq along with its ruinous interest when the war was illegal to begin with? I think former President Bush should be billed for all the material costs of the wars in Iraq. And I know it's a lot of money, but I've heard rumors that the Bush family is actually fairly rich, so they should be able to cover the costs a lot better than you and I can. Article over in Daily Mail in Great Britain. The Iraq invasion was a cock-up, and it is a cock-up we will be living with for the next 50 years. And this is from British Major General Julian Thompson. And he's absolutely right. It's a disaster on several levels. First and foremost, the utter destruction of the credibility of both the British and the United States governments, who stand absolutely exposed as having just conjured up this whole weapon of mass destruction thing out of thin air to trick all of you to go along with a war that they had wanted. Now, we're seeing video coming out of Iraq. Very little. For some reason, the social media in Iraq is now being cut off. Go figure. But some stuff is getting out through proxy servers, and there's a video of thousands of Iraqi soldiers now captured by the insurgents. Down in Australia, their Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, is saying that he will not rule out military intervention in Iraq. He had a meeting with President Barack Obama and said any request for Australian assistance will be taken seriously. We're ready to go on in there. Well, Tony, if you really feel that way, here's your rifle. Here's your parachute. We ran out of the desert camo, but here's a bright day-glow orange jumpsuit left over from Abu Ghraib. You watch your head climbing into that transport plane, and we'll call the people of Iraq and tell them you are on your way to kick their butts all by yourself. But we all remember how this mess in Iraq started with lies about non-existent nuclear weapons, so you will forgive us if we sit this next fiasco out and keep our children safe at home. Concerns over at RINF.com that this Iraq crisis could ignite a regional war. And I know there are certainly parties within the U.S. government and Israel who would like to see that happen. They're tired of waiting for 3 years to find some justification to go into Syria, and with Assad having won re-election with an overwhelming show of popular support. They're desperate to find some other way to keep the war going, get it into Syria, get it into Iran. So you can say, oh, we have to go into all these, clean out the terrorists for once and for all. But he's hit a major roadblock with regard to Iran, because Iran has come into this fray on the side of the U.S. puppet regime. And now Obama is finding himself in the very uncomfortable situation of being allied with Iran. Now, Iran has a legitimate reason for being concerned because of cross-border leaking from Iraq into Iran, but it's a brilliant move on Iran's part. Now they're going to be seen as the allies of the United States during this crisis. And that's going to make it a lot more difficult for the United States to gin up some kind of an excuse why now we have to go in and invade Iran. We ran a poll on our website. Do you support a new U.S. invasion of Iraq? We got one vote that said yes. I assume that's some government spook monitoring the website. And, of course, everybody else voted no on that one. The situation in Ukraine is getting very, very tense. The Ukrainian leadership there, Poroshenko, is now warning the Ukrainian people that Russia could cut off natural gas supplies as soon as Monday over this impasse on how much Ukraine will pay for the gas. Now, Ukrainian President Poroshenko has called on fighters to lay down their arms as the crisis deepens. Not his own fighters, of course. He's telling the other side, the people who don't want to be slaves to a government installed by force by the United States, to, you lay down your weapons and all will be well. And it's already too late for that because they have rained down utter devastation all over eastern Ukraine in the process of trying to recapture these economically productive regions of eastern Ukraine. They've destroyed the mechanisms of that productivity. They're just flattening the place. And people are fleeing eastern Ukraine. They're going into Russia. Russia's welcoming them in. The factories are being destroyed. The farmlands are being destroyed. By the time this war is over, there won't have been a valid economic gain. And the government in Kiev is going to be still as deeply in debt to the European Central Bank and the IMF and the World Bank and the Federal Reserve as they are now, and no way to repay it. Story and Investment Watch blog saying we don't have anything anymore. The utter despair of the people of eastern Ukraine as the Kiev troops just destroy everything. They're not picking military targets. It's a scorched earth policy. Now, the impasse over the gas deal is that, and remember, it is Russia's oil and gas. They can sell it for whatever the market will bear. Kiev's attitude is that Russia should go on giving Ukraine the discounted price that they enjoyed before. But that discount was in exchange for the use of the military bases in Crimea. Well, Crimea does not belong to Ukraine any longer. It belongs to Russia. And Poroshenko is standing firm that he absolutely will not buy Russian gas for any more than $268 per 1,000 cubic meters. Russia has already discounted the price down to $385 per 1,000 cubic meters. It's already a $100 discount. But Poroshenko isn't willing to budge. And that's why they're saying they may be cut off from the gas. And the situation is getting very, very tense over there because apparently Kiev forces drove an armored personnel carrier with troops inside across the border into Russia. Then they abandoned the vehicle and ran back across the border to Ukraine. Kind of wonder what that means. And I have a theory when we come back from these commercials. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. So we're talking about this very bizarre story where some of the soldiers from Kiev drove across the border to Russia in an armored personnel carrier, fully loaded with troops. They drove inside the Rostov region. Then the crew and passengers basically abandoned the vehicle, left it there, and returned to Ukraine. And, of course, Russia's security service has the vehicle now, has pictures of it. They're already complaining to the United Nations about Kiev's incursion across their border without any reason whatsoever. And you have to wonder what's going on. Then we got a second story. Now, this is coming from the Facebook page of Nenad Antony Petrovich. It is supposed to be a Vladimir Putin fan site. I don't know. Reasons to think everybody's lying here. But it is reporting that 3 Ukrainian helicopters were shot down over Russia. Now, it looks to me like Poroshenko is trying to provoke the Russians into some kind of an overt act at the border, which would allow the United States to start an open conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Remember, earlier in the week they were claiming 3 Russian tanks had crossed into Ukraine, which was complete and utter nonsense. Putin is not that stupid. And if he was that stupid, it would have been a lot more than just 3 tanks. And this sort of mirrors what Roosevelt was trying to do in the months before World War II in Pearl Harbor, where U.S. forces, which were supposed to be neutral, were sinking German ships in the North Atlantic, trying to get Hitler to do something that they could use to get the war going. And Hitler refused to bite. He was too smart for that. Meanwhile, the United States is quietly sending in an elite military unit to train the former Soviet bloc states amid the annexation of Crimea. Remember what I said before. Obama is going to say, we're not sending troops into Iraq. But that doesn't mean he can't send advisors and trainers, which is how we got into Vietnam. We're going to take a phone call here. Ken in Fort Worth. Aloha, Ken. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Robert Groden won his case in Dallas court.
Okay, please remind us again who he is and what the case was about.
Robert Groden has written many books about JFK. He got the video and put it
yes.
on. Okay, now we know who we're talking about.
Yeah.
He's got a brand new book out, and he's been working on the grassy knoll, telling people about this stuff. And they kept harassing him and arresting him and fining him and all kinds. But he won his case this morning.
Okay, and why was he being sued? I hadn't heard about.
Why did he sue the city?
Oh, he sued the city. Okay, good.
Correct.
He won his case.
Yes.
Now, if I recall correctly, he's the one who came out with documentation that there were at least 13 shots fired in Dealey Plaza. Am I correct on that?
Well, I don't know how many. I've heard different. The guy standing right there said maybe 6.
Yes.
It's hard to tell how many. I know, but one hit the cement, one hit the visor, and one went through the windshield. Everything at Oswald was a bad shot.
Yeah, had to be a really bad shot for the bullets to be flying all over the area that they were. I do know that when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was forced to look at the police dictabelt recording, that recording picked up at least 18 impulses that could have been gunfire, but the House Select Committee, claiming their budget was really too tight, only allowed scientific analysis of, I think it was 5 of them, which placed at least some of the gunfire firmly coming from the grassy knoll, which is why the House Select Committee, even though their task was to reaffirm the validity of the Warren Report, they were forced to conclude, there was more than one shooter in Dealey Plaza, and that technically means there was a conspiracy to kill the President of the United States.
How many bullets they find in JFK's limo?
I forget that number. I think the really interesting story, of course, was the bullet fragments in Governor Connolly's leg, because the X-rays seemed to indicate there was a lot more material in there than was missing from the so-called magic bullet. And I remember when Connolly passed away, it was Secretary, no, oh, God, I'm blanking on her name. It was during the Clinton years. The Attorney General, Janet Reno, said, okay, well, now that he's dead, let's have an autopsy and dig out those bullet fragments. Of course, that went away 24 hours later and was never heard from again.
Anyway, hunt Robert Groden and see what you find.
All right, we definitely will take a look. Now then, there's a big stink going on about the photos and videos that came out of eastern Ukraine showing the Kiev forces using white phosphorus shells as incendiary devices to just torch entire neighborhoods. These weapons are banned by the United Nations. It was a big stink when Israel was caught using them against the Palestinians, but as usual, nothing was done because the U.S. is out there going, veto, 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 veto. We will veto everything. But it is a war crime to use white phosphorus as an incendiary device against civilian territories. So Jen Psaki was asked about this. The little official U.S. government spokesbimbo was asked about white phosphorus shelling in Ukraine, and she asked, oh, was it by Russia? No, it was not by Russia. And what's really scary about this is the official U.S. government spokesbimbo apparently knows less about what's going on in Ukraine than anybody who's listening to this radio show right now. So if any of you are looking for a job, you might want to polish up your resume and send it over to the White House because, idiocy on display like this is not going to last very long indeed. Speaking of Israel, apparently somebody fired some bottle rockets across the fence, and Israel responded with another Gaza airstrike, saying it's all your fault. They made us do it, Mommy. And everybody understands now this is a classic Israeli trick. They have Israeli agents inside Palestine. They'll fire one of these homemade bottle rockets that never hit anything of any value. And Israel says, aha, we can launch the airstrike. And they go on in and start murdering a bunch of people. Apparently, Israel has now authorized an additional 1,000 Jewish-only settlement homes to be built on Palestinian land. They're just going to go for it. They're going to go for it. Now then, interesting little story. This was a YouTube video we linked to. And this is a flashback to 2012. Where Eric Holder is up there saying the American people need to be brainwashed. He's up there actually saying we can't have the American people thinking for themselves or deciding for themselves what's going on. We have to brainwash them. And Mr. Holder, I dare you to show me anywhere in the Constitution where the government is allowed to lie to the people or brainwash them or propagandize them. And we know the latest version of the National Defense Authorization Act does say the government has the authority to propagandize the American people, but that is not constitutional because it's not in the Constitution. And the 10th Amendment says the government can't presume a right or authority not explicitly set forth. I mean, they're openly out there saying, yes, we must lie to the people. We have to lie to the people. We can't do what we're doing unless we can lie effectively to the people, which is why they hate the independent media so much, because we've taken that away from them. The blogs, the independent media, all the websites, all of this stuff, we have forever removed from government the ability to lie to their people with impunity. And for governments that depend on that ability to get what they want, that is an absolute disaster. We can't lie to the American people? You mean we're going to have to actually go back and be the government we taught them we were in school? I don't want to do that. Which is fine with me. If you're in the government and you don't want to follow that contract with America, called the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, feel free to resign. That is the honorable and moral and just thing to do. Some numbers here. Apparently, United States nuclear weapons are, over the next decade, will cost $264 billion. For all the talk we're hearing about Iran's non-existent nuclear weapons and Iraq's non-existent nuclear weapons, the United States is spending vast sums of money to modernize the existing armaments and to build new, small, tactical nuclear weapons. And the General Accountability Office, which came out with this number, says this number does not include all of the costs, including the Air Force's plan to build a new bomber to carry the new nuclear weapons, or the modernization of the ICBM arsenal. We may not really know how much is being spent on these weapons of mass destruction by a government that claims they want to remove weapons of mass destruction from the face of the earth. What they really want is for nobody else to have these weapons of mass destruction, so those other countries will just do what the United States government tells them to do. All right, we're going to take a break for our top of the hour segment. We'll be back after these few words. Aloha, welcome to our show, and this is hour number 2. Interesting article over the Daily Mail in Great Britain. The magic is gone. Just as many Americans dislike Obama as do George W. Bush. This is according to a poll run by CNN ORC. And basically said that Americans are just as disenchanted with Obama as they were with George Bush. For the same reason. They campaign on a bunch of lies, get us into wars, erase our freedoms, loot us for the benefit of Wall Street banks. We ran a poll on our own website. Who is worse? Bush got 6%, Obama got 19%, and they are both equally evil, got 75%. So, now, not too long ago, Hillary Clinton, who's already out there kind of dancing around her run for the White House in 2016, made a comment about how broke the Clintons were, and they were struggling just like ordinary Americans. And, of course, it turns out to be an absolute joke. The Clintons made $12 million in the first year after they left the White House. They are the richest living former first family. I'm not sure I buy that second part. I would want to look at the Bush family fortunes. But the point of the matter is that these are very wealthy people. They are money junkies. They are not broke, and they have absolutely no identification with what it's like to be out here in the real world, dealing with the predations of the private central bank. Article over at the AmericanConservative.com, and it's echoing something that I was saying earlier in the week. Eric Cantor's defeat is also Netanyahu's. And they make a comment in the article about if somehow it's subliminally registered with some anti-Cantor voters, that Cantor in 2010 had more or less presented himself as Netanyahu's congressman in Washington, D.C. I don't think subliminal had anything to do with it. I think the American people are finally seeing this corrosive influence of the Israel lobby on the government of the United States of America. And they're starting to reach for their can of voter Rust-Oleum to try and deal with the problem here. The United States Department of Justice, which is being run by Eric Holder, you know, the guy who thinks that you should all be brainwashed, so you just shut up and do as you're told, apparently is asking for more than $10 billion to settle the Citigroup probe. In other words, if Citigroup will give them $10 billion, the Department of Justice will stop investigating to find out exactly how much they stole from other investors and you, the American people, through fraud. And nobody really knows yet. And this is another case of how one of these Wall Street firms will make billions and trillions of dollars through fraud, then they turn around, they give the government a piece of the action, and the government says, okay, you're off the hook. You can buy a get-out-of-jail-free card here in the United States of America. That's what all of these settlements mean. You give us this much money, we'll let you off the hook for the rest of it. And from the point of view of the bankers, it's just a cost of doing business. We're going to commit this massive mortgage-backed security fraud, and we're going to make trillions and trillions of dollars, and then the government will come in and ask for a few billion, and we'll give it to them, and we're still rich off of what we looted from the American people. Article, and I put this up here in response to the call we got yesterday from the guy who said the dollar is strong, all hail the mighty Federal Reserve note. James Rickards, and this is over at Investment Watch blog, is saying the price of oil isn't really going up. The problem is the dollar's going down, and that echoes the second call we got yesterday on the same subject. Anybody who thinks the dollar is strong, just go down to your local supermarket or your gas station and look at the prices. The dollar is not strong. The dollar is a very thin shadow of what it once was. So, another scandal is breaking loose here. You've probably seen on TV, and this is also being reported in the Daily Mail. Funny how we don't see this stuff reported here in the United States, but that's a side issue. Here's what the story is about. You've probably seen all these ads on TV for these price comparison sites for various services, hotels, travel, and so forth. Well, apparently, one of these price comparison websites dealing with car insurance has been caught colluding with the insurers to drive the prices up. It's another way of price fixing. And that's the new front for it. People go to these websites thinking they're going to get the best deal, and what they're being shown is a selection of inflated prices from which to choose. And a lot of people have noticed that when you first go to one of these websites that will sell travel arrangements, and I'm not going to name which one it is because apparently they're all doing it, that first time you visit the site, you'll get some great deals. You really, really will. But they plant a cookie on your browser. And when you come back to their website for another deal, the prices are pushed up. They're loss-leading. Anyway. Alrighty, let's see. No callers on the line here right now. A little bit of a personal tragedy. Apparently, David Rockefeller's son, Richard, has died in a small plane crash outside of Westchester Country Airport. It doesn't seem to be anything suspicious about it. 65-year-old man. He was flying a Piper, which is a very small, lightweight, fragile aircraft. And according to the airport manager, there was heavy fog. And apparently the airplane clipped some trees shortly after it took off from the runway. And so it's a tragedy. But it doesn't look to be suspicious. And I'm getting a lot of emails saying, oh, it's more wet work. Nah, in this case, it doesn't. It feels like just classic pilot error. Classic pilot error here. Now then, another story coming out of the internetpost.net. The U.S. government, and this is coming out of a report from Associated Press originally, the Obama administration has been going to local police departments and pressuring them not to disclose details about the surveillance technology they're using to sweep up your cell phone data from entire neighborhoods. This is focused mostly on the Stingray system, and the details of that system are being withheld from the public. Some of its capabilities that are known is that it can mimic a cell phone tower, so that your phones will connect with it rather than the real cell phone tower, and then, of course, they can simply siphon anything that's going in or out. Your voice communications, your pictures, your Aunt Mary's top-secret chocolate chip cookie recipe, whatever it is they want. All of it without a warrant, and more people are getting upset about it. We're starting to see, we had that federal court decision, the appeals court just earlier in the week saying that, no, you can't grab this cell phone data without a warrant and have it be legally admissible. So now apparently the Obama administration is pressuring police departments not to disclose any more information about what's going on at all. Now, here's a very bizarre story, and this is reported in Russia Today, and it concerns 13 aircraft that vanished off radars in the heart of Europe for about 25 minutes. On two occasions, they were over Austria and neighboring countries. Now, nobody crashed. Nobody got lost. The airport flight controllers instituted emergency procedures, which means direct radio contact with the aircraft and saying, we can't see you on the radar. Are you still there? Yeah, we're here. We're still on this, thus and such a course at thus and such an altitude at thus and such an airspeed. And they get out the grease pencils and they start doing it the old-fashioned way. But it has caught a lot of people by surprise, and they're wondering what is going on. And there are two possibilities. This could be the start of the virtual 9/11 false flag we've been talking about, of hacking into the computers and causing damage so the government can justify complete strict control of the internet from now on. Or somebody's testing a brand new and very effective radar jamming system. But it is worth note that this is now going on. All righty, we're going to take a break for commercials. When we're going to come back, we're going to be talking about some issues related to gun control and Obama's push for another gun grab, and some story about guns and shootings that you're not going to see covered in the corporate media. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And as you already know, the gun grabbers are in fine form this week, screaming about the explosion of violence and how guns have to be banned because it's all the fault of those guns, and has nothing to do with the economic hardships that are driving people into crime, or this flood of these prescription antidepressants that are known to trigger violence and suicide in a segment of the population. Got nothing to do with that. It's the guns. The guns are bad. The pills are good. The guns are bad. And they're going on and on about that. And on the same day that they reported on that very suspicious shooting of two police officers in Las Vegas, they did not report that in near Las Vegas there was an L.A. Police Department officer shot and killed his wife, also a member of the Las Vegas police force, and their 5-year-old son. Don't want you thinking that the police are the problem, even though they're killing a lot of people, innocent people. Meanwhile, the one thing that they don't want you to realize is that every year in this country, law-abiding citizens with legally owned firearms will stop in progress 1.6 million crimes. Now, that is a statistic the police can't match because the police are never present while the crime is being committed. They show up after it's all over, and they pose standing over the dead bodies for the press cameras to show how heroic they all are. And I remember many, many years ago when I was still living in Los Angeles, and I was very big into radio, and I had a scanner that covered the police frequencies. This is before they were encrypted. And I used to hear all the time where there'd be a violent episode going on in a home and gunfire was going off, and you'd hear the police pull up and park a block away and sit there saying, do you think the guy has left now, before they go in. I think that's one of the reasons they started encrypting the communications, along with some lawsuits coming out of some racial slurs that were heard over the radio as well. But we have over here in California, there was a 72-year-old grandmother fended off an intruder with a firearm. And apparently just said that guy tried to break into the home, and it was in an area where there'd been an earlier murder in the area with a baseball bat, and she basically just shot the guy. Another story, and this is coming out of South Carolina. A guy was trying to break into a home. The homeowner shot him and killed him, defended his home. And you're not going to hear about that. Because right now the gun grabbers don't want you thinking about guns may be useful to protect yourself from crime. They want you to think of guns only as evil and used by the criminals and not of any real use to the American people. And I got a nasty email the other day because I'd made this point that we know that drunk drivers will kill people with their cars. And drunk driving is illegal and they should go to jail. But you don't take cars away from law-abiding citizens because of the crimes of this tiny minority. And I got a nasty email saying, well, everybody needs to have cars. They're something that people can use, but nobody needs guns. Nobody really needs guns. Yeah, we do. We need guns to thwart crimes. Right now in this nation, the average wait time for a 911 call to the police department is running about 17 and a half minutes. And a lot can happen at a crime scene in 17 and a half minutes. What are you going to do? Some guy's coming into your bedroom, wants to rape you, and you say, would you mind waiting 17 minutes till the cops come here and arrest you? It's not going to happen. Meanwhile, up in Chicago, which is being held aloft as, a model of gun control across America, they're dealing with an absolute explosion of gang violence because the gangs have the guns and the law-abiding people don't, and the police are inept and helpless, often corrupt up there. We're going to grab a couple of phone calls here. David in Arkansas. Aloha, David. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. Oh, it is getting absolutely crazy. They expect us to depend on the grid for our protection, for our communications and everything else, and they're doing everything in their power to make sure that that's not going to be adequate for us. It's kind of ridiculous. I agree with everything you've been saying on this, and I'm glad you're out there talking about this because somebody needs to, and nobody in the mainstream corporatized media is, and I'm very thankful for the independent media on that. There's a lot of conversations going on between normal people, over the radio, over the shopping centers. You go out and you meet people. People are talking about this. People are more aware now than ever, and it's because of efforts like yours and getting this information out there and making it part of the dialogue between people, the water cooler conversations. People are talking about this. The reason I called is coming up on the field day weekend, and with the grid, with this society, in such peril of being collapsed because of all this, money junkie thinking, all this, economic stuff, all this war stuff, I think it's more important than ever to be able to have redundant communications, to be able to communicate with people, because as long as we can continue to communicate with each other, whether it's face-to-face, over the radio, over whatever media is available to us, we can continue to work together. They want to be able to divide us, to be able to cut our communications, and that's not a good thing. On the last weekend of June, the last full weekend of June, always, every single year, Ham Radio Field Day happens, and all the various clubs and organizations all over the country get together and set up emergency radio stations to exhibit what they can do for the public. And even if you're not interested in the hobby, it is an excellent opportunity to get out there and meet some of these people, because these are the people that are going to continue to talk when the cell phones don't work, when the TV is giving you nothing but a test pattern and government propaganda. These people are still going to be talking. I think that is extremely important.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Not only because they're going to be talking to each other, but there's a branch of amateur radio called packet radio where they're using their ham transmitters as a wireless internet, and it can reach all across the nation and around the world. Once you have a population that understands they're being lied to by the government, they're going to go out and get the truth by any method that will work. Remember, when the Soviet Union came crashing down, a big part of that had to do with the samizdat, which was this network of fax machines that were simply bucket brigading stories and articles written by the Russian people about what was going wrong in their country. And this fax machine would fax to 10 other fax machines. Each of those would fax to 10 others. And it was simply, there was no central hub. It was operating very much like the distributed Internet. And that was all the Russian people needed to educate themselves about what was really going on with their government, and definitely led to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned packet because I've actually been working on enhancing my digital communications here at the station and getting the packet on multiple bands online, being able to do gateways and being able to map all this stuff back out. So we do have a way to take digital communications and spread it all over the country without having to have the internet, which is a beautiful, awesome thing. So, check out the field day. You can go to ARRL.org, and there's all sorts of information on there. You can go to my website, W5MZ.com, and I got a little information on there. Of course, it goes to ARRL for the field day locator, that you can find an organization in your area and get to know these people, because even if you're not going to participate with them, hey, if you've got a neighbor that's into this and everything all goes wonky and nobody can talk to you, go, hey, Bob, what's going on? Because they're going to know what's going on, and we've got to stay informed. Knowing is half the battle, or at least more of it, actually. Thanks, Mike. I don't really have much else. I'll let you get back to what you're talking about, because it's a very important aloha and 7-3.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that one. I remember when my wife and I were in San Francisco when I was working on The Day After Tomorrow, and we became aware of a group of amateur computer enthusiasts, not a professional, no funding, nothing like that, and they were building a Wi-Fi network that reached all across San Francisco, and they were doing it for the benefit of San Francisco school children who were not able to afford regular broadband Wi-Fi into their homes. And this thing reached all across the city, and it was just little, PVC pipes with the equipment attached to convenient facilities. And if you link that to one ham transmitter capable of doing packet forwarding to another city, then you've got a whole new internet that's operating completely off the corporate-owned backbones. And I think that's probably going to be something that we will see. We're already seeing news stories about people, rather small towns, setting up their own dedicated internet to protect themselves from the NSA. We got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back with Aaron in Texas. And Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We got callers on the line. We're going to start with Aaron in Texas. Aloha, Aaron. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, hey, Michael. A real quick question. Why hasn't the American people been out in the streets protesting like in other countries such as Brazil and other countries going on economic crisis right now?
Boy, where were you during the Occupy movement? That was all across the country in every single city.
Yeah, I saw that, and I saw the cops beat the crap out of all these people.
Yeah, that's why they're not doing it as much anymore.
Yeah, another question real quick. Why do you think that lately cops have been killing people like left and right, and nothing happens to them? Are they trying to show an example to other cops that, hey, you can do this and nothing will happen, don't worry about it?
Oh, absolutely. When you have a dictator that is using the civilian police to try and terrorize the general population into submission, the first message that has to go out to the police is you can do whatever you want and nothing bad will happen to you. Now, we are seeing a few examples of where police are being sued by their innocent victims, and they generally wind up with a wrist slap. Again, that cop that was caught ripping off this 3-year-old Make-A-Wish recipient, he got suspended with pay. He got a paid vacation for it. And along with the fact that we have all of this new Israeli-style training of the American police forces, I mean, the ADL is out there in its own promotional literature bragging about how they are now training U.S. police departments, and they're basically training the American police to treat Americans the way the IDF treats the Palestinians. And when you add to that the fact that cops are very heavy users of these prescription psychiatric medications, and it is a formula for disaster. And again, since 9/11, the American police forces have murdered 8 times as many innocent Americans as the terrorists have.
Michael, another thing real quick. I've noticed that on a bunch of situations, if you hurt a cop, even if you spit on him or something, it's considered a third-degree felony. In some cases, even aggravated assault. It automatically sends you to prison. I feel that these cops shouldn't have no special laws. I mean, they put on a badge, they put on a uniform, they know what they're going up against. They shouldn't have no special treatment either. I mean, that's the way I feel.
Well,
a lot of these cops take that special treatment and they abuse it. Like, for instance, that Occupy Wall Street, that girl elbowed him. And he got a little black guy, and he's out there crying like a little girl. I mean, come on, you put on a badge and a uniform, and you want to be crying because you got elbowed?
Well, you need to understand the actual letter of the law is that the police are owed our obedience and cooperation only when the police themselves are within the letter of the law. There's a Supreme Court decision, John Bad Elk versus the United States, that affirmed when the police are acting illegally, American citizens have a right to resist the police acting illegally, up to and including the use of lethal force.
All right, thanks a lot, Michael. I love your show. Keep up the good work.
All right, we're going to switch over to Obi in Colorado. Aloha, Obi. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, two things. One is whenever they're ready to start things up with Iran, Israel's going to be more than happy to bomb Iran first, and then the United States will come in to back up Israel.
Well, that's one scenario, but right now Iran has come into the Iraq conflict on the side of the United States, and it's a brilliant move by Iran's government, because now, we're all allies. We're buddy-buddy. You can't turn and attack us now.
Well, that's not going to work. Israel's going to attack them anyway. And the other point is, can you buy, and this is a question for you, can you buy a radio that can pick up shortwave and ham radio signals?
Well, very much so, because the ham radio bands are embedded in what is generally considered the short wave bands, which end up at about 30 megahertz. And as a matter of fact, if you go over to the Republic Broadcasting's online store, they have a shortwave radio in there. And if you're going to buy a shortwave radio specifically to listen to the ham bands, please make sure it is able to receive what is called single sideband. Because a lot of the consumer-level shortwave radios where they figure you're listening to music and international broadcasts, they don't include that feature. And what single sideband does is it uses a subcarrier to encode the audio in order to improve the signal-to-noise ratio. But you can't really understand single sideband on a regular amplitude-modulated radio. So make sure it's got that little USB, LSB switch somewhere on the back, and you'll be able to pick up the ham bands quite easily.
Okay, and does it say single sideband? Will that, in the description of the radios, will it say something to that effect?
Yeah, it'll say single sideband or SSB, and I have to be honest, I haven't looked at the Republic Broadcasting online store in a while, but the last time I did, one of the radios they had, one of their shortwave radios did have the single sideband feature.
Okay, because I think when they cut the internet off, I'm a news junkie now. I want to hear the news, but I want to hear the truth, so I'm really going to consider buying one of those radios, so if they mess up the internet, I can still get some real news.
Well, having one of those radios, I mean, it's just the obvious addition for anybody's survival kit, hurricane kit, earthquake kit, whatever you want to call it, something with a hand crank generator, at least to listen to your local news stations and find out what's going on. You do want to listen to the international news broadcast, because you're going to get a view of what's going on in the world that's not filtered through the American political machinery. And they're very, very nice to have. And I'm a big shortwave listener. And again, if you are specifically interested in listening to the amateur bands, you definitely want to get a radio that's got the single sideband feature on it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael. I really appreciate it.
All right, you've got it there, and we're going to head on back and talk to some stories. This is an article over in The Guardian. Isn't it amazing? We're learning all this stuff about the U.S. from the European press. Okay, and the article is that the Pentagon is preparing for mass civil breakdown, which is no surprise. We've all seen them buying all this hollow point ammunition and machine guns and everything to point at us. But apparently the subject of this article is the U.S. Department of Defense has launched a research program. They're going to be funding universities to develop computer models of social dynamics, risks, and tipping points for large-scale civil unrest across the world, under the supervision of various U.S. military agencies, spending millions of dollars on this. What they want to do is have a computer program that tells them how far they can push, how much they can take, what they can do to us without actually crossing the line into a popular uprising and rebellion. Now, hopefully, these very expensive models are going to be just as accurate as the ones they used for human-caused global warming and run on computer software written by the same people who wrote healthcare.gov. My personal opinion on that one here. Apparently, Obama's getting ready to grab another 500,000 acres in New Mexico to be managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And remember, the Constitution does not allow the federal government to own land other than under federal buildings and military bases. It's another example of a government that has clearly gone off the constitutional reservation and views anybody who talks about the Constitution and limits to government as a potential terrorist. Speaking of human-caused global warming, story coming out of Stephen Goddard, it's been almost 2 years since the North Pole had a normal summer day, by which it means we are still seeing below normal temperatures, both in the summer of 2013 and so far in 2014, running far below normal. Right now, 90% of the North Atlantic is below the normal temperatures. This whole human-caused global warming nonsense is falling apart, leading to an article over at patriotspost.us. Does the hockey stick belong in the penalty box? Which is a wonderful allusion for you sports fans. And basically saying that it's time for Dr. Michael Mann, Mr. Hyde the Decline himself, to come on out and start answering some serious questions. Okay? Michael Mann's taken the position that the medieval warm period was a localized effect. Well, then, where was it cold during the medieval warm period? Okay? And, of course, there's that other bizarre situation that for 950 years, tree ring data was used to do temperatures, and then in modern times they had to discard it because it wasn't agreeing with the thermometer recordings. But they're still relying on the older data and say, that's accurate. Even though we know the modern tree data isn't accurate, we're going to rely on the old tree ring data to tell you what the temperature was. And it's all fraud. And I'm a tremendous supporter of scientific method in the hands of ordinary people so you can figure out what's going on. But individual scientists are just as easy to corrupt as individual politicians or individual clergy. Just because somebody's wearing a white lab coat and has got gold things all over their wall is no reason to assume they are being truthful or accurate with you. And this whole human-caused global warming nonsense absolutely underscores that science can be bought and politicized, and often is. It's the new religion. We're not listening to the clergy as much anymore. Oh, we'll have them listen to the scientists to tell them what to think and what to believe. I'm going to take a break for commercials, and we will be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're getting a report that fresh mass graves have been found near Krasny Liman in Ukraine containing the bodies of young men. We're still waiting for photographic evidence on that one. Apparently, and this is being reported over at patriotrising.com, the Obama administration is now forbidding lawmakers from taking any photos of the illegal immigration facilities. These are becoming a huge embarrassment. Remember, we were talking about how the U.S. government has now activated 3 military bases that were basically just sitting out there empty, doing nothing, just on standby. And they've activated 3 of them to deal with this flood of illegal immigrant children who are unaccompanied by any parent or guardian. And they're just putting these kids in there. And that's all well and good for the kids, but why couldn't they have opened some of these military bases to deal with the homeless veterans, is what I want to know. Big stink over the fact that the federal government is busing illegal immigrants from Texas to Arizona. Well, if you're going to go to the cost and expense of putting them on a bus, drive the bus south back to the border, not over to Arizona. And a lot of people are saying, what is going on here, where the government just seems intent on flooding this nation with people who are by and large criminals, even before they committed the crime of entering the United States illegally. Now, from the economic point of view, of course, if you're a globalist and you want to drop all the national borders, before you can do that, you have to level the playing field all across the globe. And because it's much easier to bring the top down than to bring the bottom up, that means crashing every single global economy, including the industrialized nations, back down to the level of a third world nation. Which also ties in with this whole Agenda 21 and global warming nonsense, because all of their solutions involve deindustrializing the industrialized world for the benefit of the unindustrialized world. They need to basically make all of the United States look like Mexico before they can drop the border, so the Mexicans won't have a reason to come flooding into this country. Now then. Let's see. Apparently, Italy's Beppe Grillo is going to join Nigel Farage in the European Union Parliament. I love to see all these upstarts finally starting to get someplace in all of this stuff here. Meanwhile, story coming out of Freep.com, the Presbyterians had their national gathering in Detroit, and they are debating divestment from Israel. So good on the Presbyterians on that. They're basically considering 4 resolutions by which the Presbyterian Church as a whole would divest its investments in Caterpillar, Motorola Solutions, and Hewlett-Packard, and any other companies that are doing business with Israel in the illegally occupied territories. So there's definitely a groundswell of opposition to all of this Israel nonsense, and I think the most obvious manifestation was Eric Cantor's surprising defeat. I think the American people are just sick and tired of all these friends of Israel dominating our political system here. Alrighty, let's talk about some science and health issues before the top of the hour, and Dr. Levin here. There's an article out of Natural Blaze about aspartame. Now, we know aspartame is a bad chemical. It was at one time considered a biological weapon because it causes your brain cells to overfire. What they call an excitotoxin. And Don Rumsfeld got his lobbying shoes on, and he got it redefined as an artificial sweetener and cleared for sale to you, the American public. And it can, in high doses, cause Parkinson's-like symptoms and various other harmful health effects. Now it turns out aspartame might be making people blind through long saturation exposure. Now, of course, aspartame, if it's allowed to get too warm, will break down into its constituent molecules, including methyl alcohol, which is wood alcohol, and that in and of itself is capable of damaging the optic nerve and leading to blindness. That's where that old thing during Prohibition, where badly made booze would make people go blind because the booze was being made with methyl alcohol instead of ethyl alcohol. And at one point, the U.S. government, to discourage people from drinking, actually put poisonous methyl alcohol into ethyl alcohol. That's where that whole denatured alcohol thing came from. And people were drinking it, and they were going blind. And and some of them died because the U.S. government wanted to poison the alcohol supply to save you from the evil sin of alcoholism. And if some of you die, well, that's just an object lesson to the rest of you serfs here. We're seeing more and more articles coming out by a society that seems to be turning away from all these synthetically manufactured, patentable molecules coming out of the big pharmaceutical companies and going back to what we have co-evolved with over millions of years. And there's more research coming out about various positive aspects of psychedelics, for example. And there's an article I'm looking at here, and this is from WakingTimes.com. And the common perception of psychedelics is that you think you've turned into an elf and you drop off a building and you joust cars and everything. But the reality is some of these hallucinogens are actually useful. And I know this because many, many years ago, there still is a drug. Its street name is ecstasy, and its chemical name is MDMA, which I forget what that actually stands for. But therapists were using it because it made the therapy process much easier. Because people who were on the MDMA could look at themselves and their traumas without the associated fear and rejection and shame reactions, and it just made the process go much faster. And apparently there's evidence showing that hallucinogens can help defeat alcoholism. Another study over at WakingTimes.com showing that cannabis has benefits for autistic children. So if your child has been driven into autism by all these chemicals in the vaccines, and you live in a state where medical marijuana is now legal, you might want to think about getting some for your kids. Small amounts, obviously. Teach them to puff responsibly, just like you teach an 18-year-old to drink responsibly. But it all comes back to that concept I've talked about before of co-evolution. When your medicines are made out of natural sources, plants, herbs, these are chemicals and molecules we have spent the last million years living with on planet Earth. There are no surprises. The pharmaceutical companies, in their desire to have something they can patent, will create brand new synthetic molecules that have never existed on this planet before. And they sort of kind of fit into the chemistry of your body where the natural versions would go, but because they're not exactly the same, they can trigger all kinds of unpredictable side effects. And I think that's a big part of modern medicine, this rejection of natural cures because they are unpatentable in favor of these very dangerous chemicals that are good for maximizing profits. And it's almost become a joke in this country. You'll be watching TV and you'll see a brand new, very expensive, glitzy commercial for the latest medication, hydrofluorostone, or whatever they're going to call it. And it's immediately followed by an ambulance chase commercial. Have you been taking hydrofluorostone? Did your nose fall off? You may be entitled to a cash settlement. It's just all churning the money. And the actual health of the American people is just not a factor. In fact, the epiphenomenon of all this commercialization of medical care is they need you to be chronically sick. If Americans were all healthy, the entire medical industrial complex would collapse. They need you to be sick. They need you to be constantly chronically ill and in need of constant ongoing treatments of symptoms. Nobody's looking for a cure for anything. If I cure you, you go away. I don't get any more money from you. If I'm treating your symptoms, you'll be back next month, and the month after that, and the month after that, and the month after that. And it's all driven by the money junkies. And again, I don't have a problem with people getting rich. James Cameron and Steve Jobs are the ones I like to hold up as examples. They got rich by making entertainments and computers we voluntarily traded our money for. And that's what capitalism is supposed to be, as opposed to the money junkies who game the system and bribe the government to write laws that just automatically siphon wealth from the working people whose labor created that wealth and puts it in the pocket of the bankers. That is not capitalism. That is fascism. We have to take a break for our top-of-the-hour segment. We'll be back with Dr. Gilbert Levin after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we get on the phone here, apparently some 200 American contractors are trapped at the Balad Air Force Base, and their escape route is cut off. They're going to try and get the Iraqi Air Force to get in there and do an evacuation. But it does look like there's this huge uprising of the entire Iraqi population that are taking their country back. We're getting another story here. This is very alarming. This is being reported by The Guardian that Obama is urgently considering air assaults on targets in Iraq and in Syria. That he may use this confrontation in Iraq to justify going in and carrying out airstrikes in Syria when we're all not looking. Alrighty, we're going to go over to the phone here, and I think joining us on the line is Dr. Gilbert Levin. Dr. Levin, are you there?
I am here.
Oh, good. I'm very glad to hear that. And the reason I wanted you back on the show today, this Friday the 13th, we're going to just take a little break away from all the war and economic news and everything and get back onto a much lighter subject, one that's very important to me, of course. And that, of course, is the idea of the current state of Mars scientific expeditions, the question of whether or not there is life, and this incredible amount of hemming and hawing and shuffling of feet that we have been seeing from NASA, which stands for Never a Straight Answer, going all the way back to Viking in 1976. Now, everyone's talking about Curiosity and its mission on Mars, but apparently there's some experiments that have not been conducted, and there's one called the Liquid Extraction Organic Analysis. What is the state of that? Why has that not been done?
Well, I have queried NASA several times on that. I even sent a FOA in, Freedom of Information Act inquiry, and they tell me it has not yet been done. Now, some of my NASA friends tell me that the reason is they suspect that there could be contamination of that instrument from chemicals brought from Earth in the spacecraft, and therefore they hesitate to run it. Well, my position is that's never going to get better, and indeed, if they ran it, they could subtract out the chemical signals that they know could be contaminants and look for other things that are not contaminants. Now, why they haven't done that in 2 years is baffling to me, and our philosophy on Viking was as soon as we got down on Mars, we wanted to do our important experiments quickly because we might lose the spacecraft through some accident or communications could be cut off. And these things have happened to Curiosity, but they seem in no hurry to do their key experiments.
Well, there's an interesting story about Viking. First of all, we all celebrate Viking as the first soft landing on Mars, but that's not entirely historically accurate. The Soviet Union actually beat the United States to a soft landing on Mars, but the spacecraft ran for something under a minute before it failed, and they never communicated with it again. So there definitely is this idea that once you're down, you do the important experiments as quickly as you can. The software to handle the images coming from Viking was originally written on the presumption that we were only going to get a maximum of 256 images from each camera from both landers. And, of course, that proved to be a huge embarrassment when those landers just kept on going and going and going like the ever-ready bunny, and we wound up getting 4,000 to 5,000 images from each of the cameras on each of the landers, and we were scrambling to rewrite the software for all of that. I think looking at all these stories that we've been getting from NASA, it does seem like there's a certain lack of forthrightness. If you'll remember back on November 29th, 2010, NASA issued a press release announcing there was going to be a news conference the following week about an amazing finding related to extraterrestrial life. And then next week came and went, and nothing was ever found. And since then, we have been seeing all these stories about how Curiosity is finding indications that Mars was once habitable, but they're sort of dancing around the question about, is it habitable now, and is there anything there? And I think what's going on here, when we go back and we look at Viking, about how your labeled release experiment delivered an absolute positive result indicating biological activity, NASA just sort of ignored it, tried to claim it was a faulty test, and they relied on the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, which was supposed to look for organic molecules and didn't find any, but we know now because of the high perchlorate content of the Martian soil, that experiment could never work. And as a matter of fact, it did detect high levels of chlorine in the samples, and Mars made the same excuse they did about the extraction organic analysis. Oh, it was contaminated with the sterilizing solution that came from Earth. And I know I've shared this with you before, but I'm going to mention it again for the benefit of our new listeners. When Marco Polo returned from the Far East, his stories of the culture of ancient China were a threat to the power structure of Europe, especially to the church, which did not want the population to know that there were advanced civilizations elsewhere in the world that did not even know who Jesus Christ was and were not subject to rule by the all-encompassing Roman Catholic Church. And they threw Marco Polo in prison. The Dominicans locked him up, but eventually stories were circulating and they had to let him go. But they tried to hide that from the people of Europe, because that knowledge was going to change the reality of their political life. And I think the same thing is going on here. We have a government that's trying to keep us all focused on working hard and paying the Federal Reserve Bank, breeding new soldiers and workers, and going off to war. And if it were ever obvious to the general population that, yes, indeed, there was indigenous life on Mars, it would be, I think, a seriously socially transformative event. We might all of a sudden decide we want to put down the guns and the bullets and stop killing each other and sort of unite together in that question, who else is out there? And that means we would be of far less use to the warmongers and the bankers. And in looking at this constant hemming and hawing coming out of NASA, where they're saying maybe, might have been, it just almost seems like there is, in fact, a political agenda to not take that step across the line to say, yeah, Mars is habitable now, and there actually is something up there. And I know you made a comment before on some of your TV interviews. Curiosity does have a special camera with a magnifier for really extreme close-up views of parts of Mars, and there are artifacts in the wide-angle pictures, like the green spots on the rocks. And for some reason, Curiosity isn't taking a close look at those. Those could be some form of lichen. The so-called blueberries, those look remarkably like hard-shelled bacterial colonies that we see here on Earth, like small versions of the stromatolites. So what's their excuse for not looking at these interesting apparent spots?
Well, I asked Mike Malin, the principal investigator and inventor of those cameras, when he was going to take a look at that. Why doesn't he do it? He said, he's absolutely going to do it. And I said, well, I'd like you to take some pictures and compare them to the images that I have in my publication way back in 1981 when I found green spots on the rocks of the Viking landing site. And everybody poo-pooed it, said there weren't any green spots. Well, they subsequently verified it, and now Curiosity shows many more. Go up to those spots, take close-up images, which you say can resolve features smaller than a human hair. We can probably tell whether they're biological or not. He assured me they would, and in the response to my FOI, NASA said all the images they've taken have been published online, and there are no close-up images of any of those rocks. So I'm baffled. But I agree with your comments, Mike, that I think now NASA does know there's life on Mars.
I think so, too. We got to take a break for commercials here. We'll be gone for about 3 minutes. We'll be back. Rented Lips. Be back with Dr. Gilbert Levin. America, welcome back to the show, and we're talking with Dr. Gilbert Levin, who was the designer of the labeled release experiment on the Viking landers, which showed there was biological activity taking place. Now, when it's finally confirmed that Mars has indigenous life, this is the guy who did it. And I will not let the history books cheat this man. Okay. So we have, NASA has officially basically said that Curiosity has achieved its major mission goal, which was finding that Mars was once inhabitable somewhere in the past. And, of course, the global warming people are out there saying, see, there's a lesson. If we don't take care of our planet, we're going to become dead. But the idea that Mars is not habitable now is a complete assumption. And even if there was no life around the two Viking lander sites, you need to remember the Viking landers were put down on very high, flat areas to minimize the risk of damage to the landers. And there are other areas on Mars that are much lower down, much wetter, much warmer. And you cannot simply say there's no life here. That's like an alien spaceship touching down on the top of one of the mountains in the Himalayas. Not Everest, which is covered with trash right now, but one of the others there, and saying, well, there's nothing here, so therefore the entire planet must be lifeless. It just doesn't really make any sense. So, on what basis is NASA taking the position that Mars is not habitable now to life that simply evolved to meet the changing environment as Mars changed?
Mike, I guarantee you, if you ran a test on the top of the Himalayas, there are plenty of microorganisms thriving there.
All right, it was a bad analogy. I apologize for that. Okay. All right, we'll put him down in a volcano. Oh, there's nothing alive here.
Oh, that's a good one. But NASA has not said why current Mars is not habitable. I really would like to hear that rationale, especially with recent papers being published in the last couple of months of microorganisms, including lichen, surviving naked space environment strapped to the outside of the International Space Station. They survive for a year and a half. They're subjected there to much more rigorous treatment than they would any place on Mars.
Well, we've got the extremophiles here on Earth. Every time they go a little bit further down into the crust or down into the thermal vents, they're finding they're just absolutely full of life. And I think a lot of biologists sort of have a very chauvinistic attitude of what life is, and they still tend to see it solely in terms of what we see as life here on the surface of the planet just out of the ocean. And it's very obvious that life is going to evolve to meet its environment, whether it's deep in the crust of the Earth or, again, at the top of Everest. And we have down in Antarctica lots of bacteria, the Atacama Desert, and these are places on planet Earth that are, a lot closer to the surface of Mars than they are to downtown Honolulu, for example. And
to these who say that maybe there could be life in certain isolated spots on Mars, Well, they're just showing they don't have any respect for Mr. Darwin. Because I'm sure Darwin works on Mars just like he did on Earth.
I'm sure absolutely it does. And I think when we finally become a true spacefaring race and we get out there, we're going to find that life evolves on planets and climates and environments completely, totally alien to what we have here on Earth. It'll be a completely different chemistry. They won't be using DNA. It'll be some other mechanism, kind of like the Andromeda strain. I would still like to see a probe go back to those methane pools on Titan and see if anything's swimming in there. And I think that would be a more groundbreaking discovery than trying to find life as we know it in the water underneath the ice on Jupiter's moons. And I think we need to broaden our horizons. But getting on back to Mars here, it does seem, looking at all of the news stories coming out, that there is, in fact, a bias. And I think in our present circumstance where the American people understand the extent to which the government lies to them to keep them under control, and has been doing so all along, it is a valid question to ask if NASA's pronouncements on certain things are, in fact, politically motivated.
May I just say that in the beginning, NASA called me, and many people did, a voice in the wilderness, a lone wolf crying out about life. Well, that's no longer the case, and in increasing numbers in recent months, I've been getting calls and emails from scientists, very respectable people in the field, who say they now believe that the labeled release experiment did detect life. Mm-hmm. I don't have a consensus yet, but I'm no longer crying out as a lone wolf in the darkness. And I'm going to publish those names in the paper I'm preparing to give in August in Houston at the annual meeting of the Mars Society. I've been invited to give the plenary address on Mars. And I'm going to make a presentation which I hope will be so simple and straightforward and so convincing that we'll start moving towards a consensus whether NASA likes it or not.
Well, I think that's a good thing. And I know we have seen all kinds of articles in the European media about other scientists, independent scientists, looking at your labeled release data and saying, yeah, it looks to them like that was an unqualified positive result. And we saw NASA basically come in and say, oh, no, it couldn't be real, and we're going to go with the GCMS, even though now NASA has admitted the GCMS couldn't have possibly worked. There was a design flaw in the experiment that didn't allow for the perchlorates in the soil, but we also know NASA never likes to admit that they were wrong about anything. And last time you were on the show, did I mention the story about the tektites?
I think you did, but go ahead, remind me.
All right, just real quick. When I was in high school, I won a science fair scholarship with a project about a type of object found on Earth called a tektite. And it's a obviously melted, vitrified, and aerodynamically shaped object that fell from the sky. But it doesn't show any signs of prolonged interaction with cosmic rays. So the implication is it had to come from someplace close, and the obvious suggestion was these were pieces of the moon blasted loose by asteroid impact, and some got swept up by the Earth's stronger gravity field, and they came down to the ground. And I did a whole project about this and making the case that they were from the moon. Then I got to go up to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and run some tests on their equipment on the tektites, and I discovered a certain level of water vapor inside the tektite glass. Well, Apollo had just come back. They brought the moon rocks back, and NASA declared the moon rocks completely, totally anhydrous. And that meant that if my tektites had water vapor in them, they couldn't come from the moon. So I changed the conclusion of my science fair project, and I still won the scholarship and everything. Then years and years later, NASA comes out and admits that, yeah, the moon rocks had water vapor in them. It was dismissed as a laboratory contaminant because, hey, we all know the moon can't contain water. And now it's been determined that the crystalline structure of the lunar soil can hold water molecules by capillary action against the vacuum of space. And so it seems like a lot of what NASA's talking about is it's politically shaped, it's conventional wisdom shaped, and they really weren't being the absolutely objective scientific process that we were led to believe here. And I think the same thing was definitely applying to Viking.
Well, what you have is a problem is that science has gotten so complicated now that it requires large budgets and many people to effectively run a major project. Now, all that funding for this is coming from NASA. So it makes it very difficult for those scientists to voice opinions that are contrary to the political voices coming out of NASA. Or, they might lose their funding.
Well, you hit the nail on the head.
Hazards when you get enormous projects requiring funding from a particular agency.
Okay, we got to take another break for commercials. We're going to be gone for about 4 minutes, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're still talking with Dr. Gilbert Levin, and I want to pull back and sort of make a couple of points about history. First of all, we all understand that we have a government that presumes to decide for us what we will know, when we will know it, what we will believe. Human-caused global warming. They're still trying to sell that one in the face of obvious facts to the contrary. And again, going back to what happened when Marco Polo came back from China, you had a ruling structure in Europe, which first of all had, up until Marco Polo, thought they were all that there was. The area around the Mediterranean, that was the earth. That's what the Old Testament had said was created, and they didn't even know about the Americas and who was living there. And now all of a sudden they're finding out about this advanced culture out in China. And the concern was you had all of the ruling bodies of Europe conspired together to try and hide this information from the ordinary people out of a fear that awareness of this new knowledge might weaken their control over the population. Now, when you have something like extraterrestrial life absolutely confirmed, it is going to change our society. It's going to change our view of our position in the universe. It's going to basically force us to see that we are just one planet amidst many. And we might be less inclined to pick up guns and kill each other over whose currency we're going to use or who gets to use the oil and the gold. And I think our power structure is very much afraid of that, especially now where their hold over us is as fragile as it is. And I think there's very definitely a propaganda reason why the U.S. government would not want an announcement that life had been confirmed elsewhere in the universe, whether it's from Viking or SETI or Curiosity, because it might be enough of a socially transformative event where they would lose control of the United States, of the American people in the world. And because of that historical precedent with Marco Polo, we know that rulers will do this sort of thing. Now, I want to make one more point, and then I'm going to give the microphone back to Dr. Levin. In the history of any planet with an intelligent technological society, there's going to be one and only one moment in all of that history where you first learn you are not alone in the universe. Just like there was one and only one moment where we set foot on another celestial body. It is historic. I think that moment has already come and gone, and I think it's being hidden from us intentionally by political interests. And my goal here is that, Dr. Levin, I've looked at the raw data myself, and I'm in agreement. That was a valid, positive result. And again, when you talk about the little green patches on the Viking and Curiosity photos, and those blueberries, which bear remarkable similarities to hard-shelled bacterial colonies here on Earth, I think there is life on Mars, and they just are concerned about announcing it, changing society to the point where they lose what little control they have left. So you're getting ready in August to present a whole new paper, and you're going to lay out all of this evidence, and you're getting the big stall from NASA over Curiosity, why they're not conducting certain experiments that would be unequivocal in their rented lips. The liquid extraction organic analysis, and just rolling over to some of these splotches on the rocks and looking at them with the hand lens camera to see if they look like lichens.
You would think that that would be the first thing they would do. But they say, no, they're still marching slowly towards their primary target. But they've announced that they've achieved their primary objective, so you would think they would at least do the other experiments. But strangely enough, no. And there's something about the fact that none of these people, even the scientists on Curiosity whom I know, will talk freely with me.
Mm-hmm. That's very, very interesting. You know, Craig in our control room just sent me a message. It's absolutely valid. The confirmation of life on other worlds would be seriously upsetting to organized religion, which has a long history of torturing anybody who comes up with scientific information that contradicts the Bible. And the Bible says nothing about life on other worlds. The Bible says Earth is it, and everything else is just decoration hanging around in the firmament. And although Pope Francis recently came out and said if there are Martians and they're willing to be baptized, they'll be allowed into heaven. So,
well, I don't want to speculate on the reason. I've been thinking about it a long time, but I don't want to speculate on the reason. But I have concluded that NASA, the government, does know there's life on Mars, but doesn't want us to know.
Well, let me give you two other ideas. Along with the social transformation issue, there are portions of our population who would be delighted to get the news. All the science fiction fans, all the kids. There are other people who would find that revelation very, very frightening. And part of what may be going on would be looking back at Orson Welles' Mercury Theater of the Air broadcast on Halloween, the War of the Worlds, where they retold the story of War of the Worlds as an ongoing live news broadcast, and it triggered riots and panics all across the country. And so somebody in the government may say, well, look, if we announce there are microbes on Mars, you know, everybody might panic. We're going to be invaded. And obviously, I don't think people are going to conflate microbes on Mars with an impending alien invasion. But that might be another factor that's in there. But at this point, knowing how much this government lies, knowing how much the control freaks want to keep control over everything that's in our heads, and again, looking back at the raw data and how you have been treated because of the conclusions of your experiment, I, too, am absolutely convinced there is life on Mars right now, and NASA is sort of edging up to that revelation by saying, well, we're convinced there was life on Mars once, and I guess they're waiting for some opportunity where they're going to take that final step over and say, yeah, Mars has indigenous life that evolved there independently of Earth, and it will be socially transformative, I think.
I think it would have a big impact. And, you know, if NASA thinks or announce that the LR did not detect life, they have to admit it detected something in the material on the surface of Mars that was highly reactive. That in itself is a major finding. It's the most major finding of any of the experiments that have been sent to Mars. So the question is, why haven't they gone back to try and find out what it is, even if it's not life? What is it that's causing this reaction? But in the 38 years since Viking, they've never sent an experiment back to find that out.
Well, for the benefit of our listeners who are not familiar with what we're talking about with the labeled release experiment, this is not a blue sky technology that was made up just for Viking. This is an adaptation of a standard process for testing civil water systems for bacterial contamination. And all it involves is you take some of the water out of the pipe and you put it in a nutrient solution that is tagged with a radioactive isotope, and then you wait for any bacteria that are in the water to ingest the nutrients and excrete radioactive materials, some of which are a gas, which will bubble up out of the water and hit a radiation detector overhead. This is a standard method used around the world for testing civil water systems to make sure they're clean of infection. It doesn't even identify what bacteria are there. It just says, hey, there's something here, you need to look further. And that was what the labeled release experiment did on Viking. They took some Martian soil, they put it in the nutrient solution, and then they just waited for any bacteria that were in the soil to burp, and that would be detected by the radiation detector, and that's exactly what happened.
That's what happened, but we went one step further. That result was plenty good enough on Earth, but we decided that since we're going to a strange world, maybe we better back it up with a control to prove that it wasn't something not alive that caused the reaction. And NASA agreed, and they even said what that control should be. They said, if you get a positive response, which we doubt, you should take another sample of that same soil and heat it up to a temperature that would kill any life, but not destroy any strong chemical that might have provoked that response. And they set the terms. They said that should be heating the sample to 160 degrees C. Nothing on Earth survives that we know of. And holding it there for 3 hours, letting it cool, and then running the experiment again. If you get no response, that means you have killed organisms, and we will accept that as proof of life. If you get a response, that means you haven't detected organisms, but there's some chemical that's mimicking life in your experiment. But when we satisfied those criteria, they immediately moved the goalposts.
That sounds politically motivated to me. We have one more commercial break, and then we're going to come back for the last segment of today's show with Dr. Gilbert Levin and life on Mars. Microbial, little tiny life. Not going to get in a spaceship and come on down here and inconvenience us. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Our guest is Dr. Gilbert Levin. This is the last segment of our show today, and I want to start off this segment with a little story, which I think illustrates very much the reality of what NASA is like. And it goes back to the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger. And I actually knew one of the crew members, Judy Resnick, and I'd worked with her in Houston just 3 months before the flight. And NASA's official position was, we don't know what caused it. All the systems were working. When concerns were raised about the poor quality design of the segments for the solid rocket boosters, and in particular the O-rings, and Morton Thiokol had said, look, don't launch this thing after you've had this cold a night. And NASA's position was, well, there's no reason to think the O-rings were a problem. And they maintained that up until Richard Feynman walked into the hearings with a glass of ice water with a piece of the O-ring material in it, in a clamp, took it out of the ice water, undid the clamp, and the O-ring was still in its crushed position, proving that all the numbers about the durability of the material used in the O-rings were just a complete fabrication by NASA wanting to put forward a certain image. And over time it came out there had been other burn-throughs on the SRBs. NASA knew there was a problem, was trying to basically keep up with the schedule, and was all driven by politics and a bunch of MBAs. And I remember I was with NASA when they went from the old NASA to the new NASA, when the scientists were taken out of the control positions and it was all turned over to political appointees and MBAs, and it was an absolute disaster. But we now understand, because of this, because of the water vapor in the Apollo moon rocks, that what NASA tells the public is very often constrained by political realities, political pressure, commercial interests, certainly. Now, we understand that the church is going to be very threatened by the announcement of absolute proof of life in other worlds. It doesn't fit in with their theology, and the church reacts very negatively to that. Now, my personal opinion, for those of you who go over to my website and read about it, I think this whole theory of the Big Bang is actually just more religion trying to look like science, because when Edwin Hubble discovered the redshift, he himself did not make any implications about it, meaning anything at all. He just said the further an object is away from Earth, the more the spectrum is redshifted. And we know there are multiple explanations for it, including phenomenon like Rayleigh scattering. It was a Catholic priest who was also an astronomer, Georges Lemaitre, who said, the redshift means they're flying away from us, and if we wind the time clock backward, it means they all come together to a single moment of creation. Huzzah, huzzah! Science has proven the biblical story of a supreme moment of creation. And the Big Bang Theory really took off at that point, but it should have ended when Einstein came along with his theory of general relativity, which would have meant it was impossible for this singularity to ever escape its own gravity field. But under pressure and encouragement from religious institutions, cosmologists were funded to try and find an explanation around all of this, why the laws of physics simply did not apply for the first few seconds the universe was in existence. You know, magic happened. You know, God did this, and then the laws of physics took over. And it basically means the Large Hadron Collider at CERN is no different than the big cathedrals of Europe or Stonehenge or the pyramids. It is a fantastically expensive construction attempting to communicate with the gods. And we know science in our culture is subordinate to political and religious and economic influences. And I think that's what happened here. And the more I look at this and the more these other scientists around the world look at it, the more we need to recognize that Dr. Gilbert Levin is the man who first confirmed life exists on other worlds in the universe. And I really am going to wish you a lot of luck coming up in August. And if there's anything I can personally do to support you and help get this stuff out, do not hesitate to call me on that at all. And we've got about maybe 7 minutes left if there's anything else you'd like to share with our listeners.
Well, first of all, I would just like to say I'm very impressed, Mike, with your knowledge about this Life on Mars business. You really are into the science, and for being a radio host, I think remarkably informed. I really appreciate that. You have not said anything wrong as far as I'm concerned, listening to what you've said about the label release experiment and life on Mars. So I think that's very good. In addition to the talk I'm going to give August 8th in Houston, I've been invited to a debate sponsored by the Mars Express people, which is going to be held July 31st at American University here in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. And I'm not certain yet whom my debate opponent will be. They've been trying to get Chris McKay, but don't know whether or not he can cross the country for it. At any rate, I hope it also stirs up additional interest and comment, and I'm looking forward to new scientist names coming to join the list that I will publish in my paper that I give at Houston.
All right, that will be amazing. I think we're in a place in history where there are way too many persons of influence who are afraid of the facts and the truth, whether it's the facts behind our political corruptions or the facts of science. And I know our technology has seen tremendous advancement, but it almost seems like culturally and socially, we're not that far removed from the days of Galileo, when scientists would find information that contradicted the accepted wisdom or the desired propaganda. And fortunately, of course, they're not going to torture you and burn you at the stake, I hope. But we should never, as a people, as a culture, as a civilization, we should never be afraid of scientifically validated facts, even if they contradict cherished beliefs, and certainly not if they contradict certain political agendas.
Well, I don't know about that burning at the stake in the modern context. I was told by a very prominent scientist at NASA that, you can keep trying to talk, but we are going to marginalize you. So that's the same as being burned at the stake professionally.
We saw a lot of that with this whole global warming nonsense. Everybody who stood up and said, look, the world is getting colder. And so, oh, no, we're going to take away your funding, going to take away your tenure, and we're going to have the media ridicule you. And no, it's not as severe as actually being physically burned at the stake. But yes, it is the modern equivalent. And everybody who criticized the so-called science behind global warming has been subjected to a modern version of the Inquisition, as have you.
Yeah, well, the big problem that I cannot understand is why the journalists don't really seize on this, and instead of asking NASA the hard questions, they merely take the NASA releases about what wonderful things Curiosity has done. Well, I'm trying to find the wonderful scientific things that Curiosity has done, and I can't find them. I keep finding statements from the investigators, oh, we've gotten wonderful data, but either that data is not produced or it's stuff that we've known all along. And the new data that they could get, they're not either looking for or certainly not reporting. A mystery. Where are the journalists?
Well, today's idea of a journalist is somebody who accepts the press handouts and parrots them. And to go back on your very kind compliment to me, I wasn't always a talk radio host, and I did come originally from a science background before I got into motion pictures, and now I'm a talk radio host. And the idea of a journalist that would be on the level of an Edward R. Murrow, that's now actively discouraged. Because there are so many people who see their role as controlling what we know and what we think and what we believe for their benefit.
You mentioned Edward R. Murrow. Just the other night, I'm watching some talking heads on the news, and I said, where is Edward R. Murrow? That's whom we need.
We really do. We are out of time. Dr. Levin, I'm going to let you go. I'm going to communicate with you by email. about your upcoming events and also about scheduling another interview with you in August about the same time that you're doing this presentation here. So thank you for spending this last hour with us. This is all so exciting, and it's frustrating to just see the hard facts and data in front of us and just see this massive structure saying, we don't see it, we don't hear it, you can't make us, nya, 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 nya. And it is frustratingly extreme. Dr. Gilbert, goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
All right, there we go. All right, there's the music. It's time for Claire and I to head on out of here. Today's our day to go out with these Feed the Hungry programs here on the island of Oahu. Have a good weekend. We'll be back here on Monday here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay informed, stay skeptical, stay angry, make good choices. Share what you know with who you know. Please go over to Republic Broadcasting, hit that donate button. We're not going to make it without you. It is that serious. Have a good weekend. Aloha, America.